Let's talk about sex. Um, Sex in the Christian context is supposed to be a home between the husband and the wife. And otherwise, there is a system of destruction and prostitution that looks a bit like, whereas ideally there would be A and B in terms of a line segment as a comparative model to explain the logical structuralism that the geometric levels of our world have given, or at least presented to us to understand the world through. So we have A and B creating a segment, which would be such as husband and wife. And then there's the concept where A is either left alone and B is attacked. B is attacked by multiple C's attacking him. So through flirting, prostitution, and flirting, and multiple sexual offers. What this does is once it breaks the covenant between A and B, it makes it such that B is now sleeping with one of the C's. When B goes and sleeps with one of the C's, he takes his spiritual goodness and power and takes it to one of the C's who isn't fit to receive it. And then, upon giving one's sacred power and self to something small and unrighteous, like a prostitute, what that then does to be is it makes it lose its sensitivity, its intellect, its capacity, its morals. And what it also does invertedly is it makes the position of B feel as though it is a king, as though it is worthy, because it has all of this false affirmation coming from prostitutes. And instead of having the godly love where the strength of God is strengthened through A and B as one covenant and one connection, B goes out and gets multiple forms of affirmation and praise and connection. And I wouldn't even say connection, I would just say an influence from a bunch of C's, which makes them feel powerful. It's a false power, granted, and it's an unrighteous power, granted. And one could say it's not even a real righteousness at all. Thank you. Have a good night. Thanks.
Can I see the text from not the party?
I'll send it to you. Thank you.
Just wanted to listen.
Thank you. What this does is it makes B spiritually weak, and it makes B easy to be attacked, because it makes it such that they make themselves open to any and too many women who solely affirm them on the false premise, either that of money or that of sexual pleasure, in small, minuscule, banal things that are not nearly comparable to the spiritual growth that is supposed to come about, in the spiritual nourishment and connection that is supposed to happen in a sacred relationship between husband and wife, which would otherwise be related to as the A and B line segment. When B stands alone and allows for multiple women to penetrate his atmosphere, as opposed to using spiritual protection to dismiss and or refuse those persons, prostitutes, otherwise, they make it such that they are open to hedonism in that regard. Granted, the spiritual nourishment, the prayer life, the communication with God, and the well-being and the will for the ascertainment of the soul to improve upwardly also doesn't happen from prostitutes as it would with a wife. It doesn't happen from prostitutes at all, because their ethical and spiritual intent is completely and directly opposite of that of the sacred and the godly. So the prostitute's will is to make the man feel like his social responsibility is non-important and non-relevant, and that he shouldn't be prioritizing it, and that instead the material waste that he gives to prostitutes and hookers, such as money, food, candy, and sex and attention, laughter and jokes at the inappropriate things that they do, is rather they lie to him and say that it's more important. If the man is spiritually weak, he gives into it, and he lives a life where he is overtaken by prostitutes repeatedly, allowing for them to lessen his value spiritually through weakness and through the constant affirmation of him in a sexual form, making him submissive to bad ethics, which comes about in the exchange of sex, the communication of the other things that the person wills to do is exchanged as well. And object B, the person who was overtaken by prostitutes, and begins to do, whether small or large, the requests, tasks, and characteristics of the prostitutes. And so it's really a misfortune. A, on the other hand, stands alone and can refuse it. Of course, they can teach it, as I've done, or they can teach it. But they otherwise stand alone and don't have the protection from B, because B's attention is otherwise spread between the righteousness that A needs and the hedonism otherwise that the prostitutes want. And eventually he gives into the prostitutes if he doesn't use the spiritual maturity to pray, resist the prostitutes, and tend to A as A's covenant leader, protector, husband. The inability to make decisions properly after repeated use of prostitution comes about through object B giving into prostitutes repeatedly, and then lessening the sensitivity that would have otherwise protected him from the first set of prostitutes, or maybe even the first two prostitutes, where the idea was still anew and still something to be resisted in terms of not exactly knowing if one would want that. But after repeatedly doing it, they become desensitized to it and allow for essentially anyone to sleep with them, and then the repetitive notion of being slept with and lessening one's value and sensitivity in that which they can give to others. The next thing is the concept of I don't want to say a threesome, but I would say interference in a consecrated relationship where there's A and B who should be giving themselves completely to one another. And then there is the third party which comes in that is asking for attention. Now, if the male tends to stop looking at his wife at object A and begins to look at object A as something to be appeased by object D, which we're going to call the prostitute, it makes it such that the prostitute begins to be treated sort of like a child to appease the mother, which would be object A, by D, which is the father role that the husband then begins to play, which is not okay at all. And granted, this is still done in a way that is sexual. And then the refusal of the mother leads it such that D begins to only play with, I hate that terminology, B, which is the child that they're using to appease A through. And then the last thing is so otherwise the only, logical, probable method that this should exist in is if the wife is looking up at the husband, looking up to the husband, as he is her protector. In any other means, as I understand it, there is no sacredness by any other means. And so it's really a misfortune. If we want to discuss rather the attention, I guess you could say, that is given to one of the persons, like in the structure of DB over A, then there is a disrespect granted that goes on to the husband immediately, from someone essentially trying to seduce his bride, which is a bad thing. And that would require that some limitations are put in place, such as telling the other person to stop, that they're not going to ruin your marriage, you're not interested in having them in your marriage, you don't appreciate the way they're speaking about your bride, even such that the notion of sexualization shouldn't even be apparent to those persons, as the woman should be sacredly kept for the husband and the husband should be protecting her. And so in any horrendous case where her school friends are standing by the window soliciting her sex life in a rudimentary and retaliatory means towards her marrying someone different than who they otherwise know, the entire scheme of this is preposterous in terms of legality and civil notion. But otherwise, in terms of spirituality, it would be completely disrespectful for any person to be talking to either the bride or the husband regarding sex or anything related to it, because that is a sacred entity between the two of them. I did draw a structure to explain both ideas that I will put forward on the front of the video, but be careful of prostitution and be prayerful. And to end this video, I will actually read a portion of the Bible which describes husband and wives in the roles and character characteristics that we should live by. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That is Ephesians 5:2. Follow God's example. This is Ephesians 5, verse 1. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you, this is verse 3, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. Nor of this you can be sure, for of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. Verse 8 says, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Instructions for Christian households. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. I don't personally believe in the idea of having in-laws, because in the social cultural context, I find that it's too problematic, and I think in the role of the house of the church, if there's a head to the house, then there's no need for anyone else to be in it. And this is even prior to a marriage having children. If the husband is there, then there is nothing else that is needed, because he is the entire house, and the wife simply dwells within him. As Christians, dwell within Jesus. And so the severity of destroying a woman's house by even touching her husband is detrimental, as she no longer will have a place to live if he allows that. And so to this extent, there's question of violence in marriage, where if it's okay to be violent with someone who's trying to ruin your marriage or trying to touch your husband. Some cultures say yes. Others have other means to communicate harassment and disrespect, but I do feel that affairs are completely preventable.